whether or not a juror has been compromised to enable the judge to make an informed decision. That is described as a duty, and in our submission it's not surprising in light of, and it's one of the reasons why I went to the bias test first, in light of the bias test. If the issue is, and we submit it is there a real risk of bias in the mind of a fair-minded bystander, then if there is uncertainty, that means you can't rule out the real risk. The information essentially allows a judge to decide the extent to which there is a risk of prejudice and the extent to and what steps need to be taken to address that. It makes it clear also that if jurors are discharged, they are entitled to an explanation. And perhaps more importantly, looking at the second incident rather, they may need a direction is to disregard comments from the discharged juror. And that's, if you think about the second incident, I've complained in one sense that we don't know whether there was contact between the discharged juror and others about this incident, and we don't know what was said because the juror the questioning of the juror stopped before she described the incident at the prison. Arguably, at least one way of doing that, which might have limited the poison, would have been to be more specific, essentially, about the need to disregard anything the juror might have said. And that's what happened in Taylor, in fact, we'll come to. The bench book goes on to recognise, essentially, that misconduct may require the whole jury to be discharged before a verdict. It doesn't say very much about the circumstances, but certainly recognises that that is one way of potentially dealing with the issue of jury misconduct. So that, in our submission, is, in one sense, the Jamaican guidance. As I say, I accepted post-dates, but it's meant to reflect Jamaican practice. The other authority that's worth paying attention to, not least because it's been applied by this court in the Taylor case, was because it is closer to the time of the trial, and as I've said, there's every indication that standards in England and Jamaica are no different. There is the guidance issued by the President of the Queen's Bench Division, Sir John Thomas, as he then was, in 2012, and that's at 8161 of the bundle. A couple of things that it adds that aren't necessarily clear from the Jamaican bench book is, firstly, it makes it clear that, in one sense, the first step, which can happen in open court, is to invite submissions from the advocates. Secondly, probably more importantly, it makes the point before that about isolation, that there may be a need to isolate jurors who are who perhaps have given rise to concerns. The reason I draw attention to that is not because it necessarily was clear that by the time the problems arose in this case, isolation would have made a difference, particularly in relation to the third incident. Obviously, on the forewoman's evidence, everyone in the jury knew that one of their members was trying to bribe them. The reason I draw attention to that is that if one thinks about the underlying purpose of that, it links to the point that's made in Putnam about the importance of isolating the poison. It is a recognition in our submission of the approach in Putnam that once something is going wrong, there is a real risk that information can spread within the jury, that, as I say, to use the language, poison can be spread.
In one view, you don't even need to go that far. mean, if the judge was satisfied that one juror was trying to bribe others,
Yes.
then it would follow that that juror was not performing his duties as a juror properly, as giving an impartial verdict based on the evidence, and therefore should no longer continue to serve. And if you get that far, then the trial has to come to an end, because under the legislation, in a murder case, there must be a verdict can only be returned of a jury with at least 11 members.
Yeah, well, in one sense, that's why, and I started this morning and then started the submissions about juries by saying, I'm going to go into the detail because obviously I want to take every point I can because I want to...
Yes, I appreciate that. I mean, I'm really making it's a two-level thing. I mean, on one view, once you have one juror who is clearly suspect, that's an end of it.
Well, exactly, and that's why I started making that.
And you don't even need to start thinking about what the impact might have been on the other 9.
Absolutely.
But I appreciate that's a further argument that can be developed.
Absolutely, but my Lord, I deliberately started with that point because in one sense it is really important not to lose the... And of course, my Lord used the language of suspicion. We know he was now convicted of that, and that's the question for this court is, was this an independent, impartial trial? And in light of what we now know, it's difficult to see how it could have been when one of the jurors, and one of the jurors who had to be there, was subsequently convicted of essentially being involved in the bribery. I said I'd take you, my lords, to Putnam, and I will now, if I may. Yes, can I start at least by Putnam, because I'm just conscious of running out of time. Putnam's at 7577, and it is another bribery case. In that case, unlike this case, the bribe was not something that the judge was aware of until after the trial, but the judgment clearly contains important guidance on what judges should do if bribery becomes an issue during the trial. This was also a case where the bribery wasn't internal to the jury, it was an external approach. The critical point, really, though, that comes out of this is that while the Court of Appeal, presided over by Lord Justice Bingham, as he then was, recognises that there may be circumstances in which a juror who is approached with a bribe can continue to sit, it seems to imply several things. Firstly, if you look probably about 10 lines up from the bottom, Lord Bingham was of the opinion that the juror who was approached can only continue if there's not impropriety, and there needs to be a very emphatic direction. But given perhaps that reference to the need for impropriety, there is a particular concern, Lord Bingham makes clear, if the juror who's approached delays coming forward. And you see that at the bottom of page 758, that paragraph and the whole of that paragraph, because the concern is... 7578. It's the last 2 lines, and then the paragraph goes over the next page.
Right.
And what Lord Bingham seems to be saying in those two, in that passage, is that if there's delay in a juror coming forward, that raises 2 very important questions. Firstly, is that juror failing to comply with their duty because they're not drawing attention to the bribe? And secondly, the longer the problem continues, the more there is a risk that the bribe will have unconsciously influenced. And that's the context of what Lord Bingham says at the end of 7579, the bottom, the last 10 lines.
It's also it's quite helpful, perhaps, just to see the test, as it were, being applied on that page. 7579, lines 5 to 6, the judge would not, we think, have felt able to eliminate the real risk that the juror might, as a result, whether consciously or unconsciously, have become prejudiced for or against one or some defendant. So that seems to be the test is applying a real risk of prejudice, either conscious or unconscious.
Yes, and that's, of course, one of the problems with the approach to the other jurors, is the other jurors may say, I think I can reject this bribery attempt. But of course, they then got something, a very prejudicial piece of information in their minds. Very difficult potentially to eliminate that. And of course, that test was being applied before Porter and McGill and before the adjustments, relatively slight adjustments, but the adjustments that were made, the introduction of the fair-minded bystander test. But it still echoes that test because it's applying a real risk approach. So my submission remains valid. And the approach you described, it's just worth looking at the bottom, as I say, the last 10 lines in particular of 7579, where Lord Bingham essentially focuses on the need for his language, collective integrity and individual integrity. That's obviously a problem if you've got one person who's offering bribes. It's impossible to see how there's either collective or individual integrity. It deals with the issue of potentially isolating the poison, but recognises there's a real problem if you can't isolate it. And of course, here, the poison couldn't be isolated because the judge allowed the juror offering bribes and everyone who knew about those bribes to participate in the decision making, in the verdict. I'm slightly overrun, but that's probably a good point to break for lunch.
Yes. Thank you, Mr. Sully.
Sorry, I assume that's probably a little presumptuous.
It's a convenient moment for the court as well. We'll adjourn and resume at 2 o'clock.